The mythical and dazzling gold of the Incas lured Spanish conquistadors across oceans, promising untold riches and eternal glory. But Peru, which became the arena for their ambitions, proved to be not just a land of treasures, but a crucible where destinies were forged, giving rise to unprecedented conflicts. At the heart of this drama stood Francisco Pizarro, an iron-willed, calculating conqueror, and Diego de Almagro, his longtime yet unruly partner, whose straightforwardness masked deep ambition. They were bound by a common objective: the conquest of the Inca Empire and the division of its wealth. However, even in the early stages of this bloody endeavor, fractures began to appear in their alliance. Each new province, each treasure acquired, instead of strengthening their brotherhood, merely added fuel to the fire of their nascent animosity, fueled by greed and an insatiable thirst for personal power. It was in the struggle for these lands and their fate that their paths began to diverge, foreshadowing an inevitable clash of interests. Amidst escalating tensions, Diego de Almagro displayed his pragmatism when Pedro de Alvarado appeared on the horizon of Peru. Instead of direct confrontation, Almagro, weighing the risks of a two-front war, chose the path of negotiation. For a formidable 100,000 gold pesos, a sum equivalent to the wealth of an entire kingdom, he convinced Alvarado to leave Peru, acquiring not only his fleet and a portion of his troops, but also significant political leverage. This deal seemingly strengthened his position, providing much-needed resources and ridding him of a dangerous rival. However, beneath the mask of a tactical victory lay merely a postponement. By paying gold for peace with one adversary, Almagro failed to eliminate the root of all evil, the insatiable hunger for power and wealth, which would soon pit him against Pizarro once more. This was merely a prologue to a deeper and inevitable confrontation. And while Almagro enjoyed his short-lived triumph, the fate of their territories was being decided on another continent. While passions flared in the New World, the true resolution, or rather, exacerbation, of the conflict was being forged on the Iberian Peninsula. Hernando Pizarro, Francisco's brother, undertook the mission to convince the crown of his family's exceptional merits. His diplomatic prowess, though tainted by future deeds, proved exceptional. At the court of Charles V, he achieved unprecedented success. Francisco Pizarro was not only affirmed in his holdings, but also elevated to the rank of Marquess, and his authority expanded to encompass the vast territories of New Castile. Diego de Almagro, though he received the title of Adelantado and the governorship of New Toledo, faced a devilish ambiguity. The borders of his territories were described so vaguely, 200 leagues south of Puerto de Paz, that this created not a field for cooperation, but a minefield for future territorial disputes. This ambiguity harbored not so much a compromise as a deferred battle, where the ink of the royal decree portended rivers of blood, and the news of these decisions, crossing the ocean, carried not peace, but the harbinger of a storm. The news of the royal favors, delivered by Hernando Pizarro, only added fuel to the smoldering conflict. Diego de Almagro, officially recognized as Adelantado and governor of New Toledo, immediately interpreted the vague border description in his favor. 200 leagues south of Puerto de Paz. This phrase was enough for Almagro to declare Cusco, the heart of the Inca Empire, and Peru's treasury, his rightful territory. This bold declaration instantly led to open confrontation with the Pizarro brothers, Juan and Gonzalo, who held the city. Tension reached its peak when Francisco Pizarro himself, the great Marquess, appeared on the horizon, returning from Lima. His presence at this critical moment was not merely the return of a leader, but the inevitable collision of two titanic ambitions. It seemed that Peru stood on the brink of civil war, yet fate, or perhaps calculated pragmatism, temporarily delayed the bloody denouement. The precarious truce between Pizarro and Almagro, born more out of necessity than genuine reconciliation, culminated in a dramatic act. In the presence of the entire army and clergy, these two pillars of the conquest of Peru seemingly restored their friendship. They solemnly swore on sacred relics, affirming their camaraderie and intention to share future conquests. However, beneath this grand ceremony lay profound deceit. For Pizarro, it was merely a tactical maneuver, a way to postpone the inevitable and buy time. For Almagro, whose heart was consumed by resentment over the unjust distribution of land and power, this act served only as a bitter reminder of betrayal. His inability to forgive Pizarro, his constant feeling of being shortchanged, festered beneath the veneer of temporary peace. He could not forget how his ambitions had been curtailed, and his dreams of his own governorship shattered by royal decrees interpreted in his rival's favor. True reconciliation was impossible where gold and power were valued above any oaths. While Cusco remained a bone of contention, Almagro sought his path to greatness, turning his gaze southward. Weary of the endless squabbles over Cusco, and feeling cheated in his claims to Inca wealth, Almagro turned his attention south. His ambitions demanded new territory, a new El Dorado, which would finally solidify his status and secure an independent governorship. With remarkable energy, he began preparing for an expedition to the lands later known as Chile. Sparing no expense, he lavished vast sums on equipment and attracting volunteers, promising them untold treasures and new encomiendas. Thousands of Spaniards, eager for gold and glory, joined his ranks. Followed by tens of thousands of indigenous porters and auxiliary troops, whose fate was merely to serve as instruments in this conquistadorial adventure. It was an army whose sheer scale attested to the grandeur of his plans. Almagro believed that beyond the horizon awaited not merely wealth, but absolute power, capable of forever ending his dependence on Pizarro. He yearned for a new discovery that would overshadow the conquests of Peru, unaware that the path to this dream would be paved not with gold, but with suffering unimaginable, even for the most seasoned adventurers. The southward path chosen by Diego de Almagro proved to be a trial capable of breaking the will of even the most resilient. The crossing of the impassable Andes turned into a nightmare. Bone-chilling cold, altitude sickness, and exhaustion claimed the lives of Spaniards and tens of thousands of indigenous porters, who collapsed and died, unable to bear the hardships. The cold was so severe that many lost fingers and toes, a chronicler recalled, describing these inhumane conditions. After the icy hell of the mountains, another abyss awaited them, the scorching Atacama Desert, where the sun mercilessly baked away moisture, and mirages only intensified the torments of thirst. But the elements were not their only enemy. Local tribes, unfamiliar with the Inca yoke, met the foreigners with fierce, unpredictable resistance. Their arrows and spears shattered the illusion of an easy victory, turning every step into a bloody struggle for survival. This hellish odyssey seemed to lead only to new suffering, promising nothing in return but a bitter realization. After the unbearable trials of the Andes and Atacama, where every step cost a life, a harsh truth dawned upon Almagro and his exhausted soldiers. The promised Chile held no golden treasures. This land, though rich in natural resources, offered no easy spoils, so coveted by the conquistadors. This country was not even worth naming, for it is barren and worthless, wrote one disillusioned participant of the expedition. Morale was shattered, and the exhausted soldiers flatly refused to continue the futile journey. The realization of the futility of his efforts became a bitter, but inevitable, conclusion for Almagro. He made the decision to return, and this turnaround, dictated by despair rather than strategic calculation, fatally weakened his position in Peru. While Almagro struggled back, an unprecedented fire raged in the very heart of the Inca Empire, threatening to engulf all Spanish conquests. While a disillusioned Diego de Almagro made his way out of the desolate expanses of Chile, Peru itself descended into chaos. Manco Capac's rebellion, erupting with fury, swept across the entire Inca Empire, threatening to erase the Spanish presence. Cusco, the heart of Tawantinsuyu, became a besieged fortress, where the Pizarro brothers, Juan and Gonzalo, desperately held their ground. Each day brought new losses. In the heat of one attack, Juan Pizarro, reckless and brave, fell, struck down by a stone. Losses mounted, and provisions dwindled. The threat of complete annihilation loomed over the Spaniards. Their grandeur, their wealth, their very lives hung by a thread, as the flames of Inca vengeance raged around the walls of the ancient capital, threatening to consume all they had conquered. This crisis was not only military, but existential. Exhausted by the trials of Chile, Diego de Almagro and his veterans returned to Peru at the most dramatic moment. Cusco, the heart of the Inca Empire and the apple of discord, was in a desperate situation, besieged by Manco Capac's forces. The Pizarro brothers, Hernando and Gonzalo, were holding out, their strength and hope dwindling. Almagro's appearance was a shock to them, but also a salvation. Without losing a moment, The Adelantado displayed a decisiveness that the besieged sorely lacked. His battle-hardened soldiers, though weary, proved strong enough to deliver a crushing blow to the indigenous forces, routing them and lifting the siege from the city. Almagro, an outcast just yesterday, now stood before the walls of Cusco as its liberator. But this role as a savior was merely a convenient mask for long-held ambitions he had no intention of concealing. After saving Cusco from the Inca siege, Diego de Almagro, as if justifying his former ambitions, wasted no time. Citing that same treacherously vague wording of the royal decree regarding the borders of New Toledo, he declared the ancient Inca capital his rightful territory. This was not merely a political maneuver, but a display of force. His weary, yet Chilean desert-hardened soldiers entered the city unopposed. Almagro's superiority was evident. The Pizarro brothers, Hernando and Gonzalo, who had defended Cusco from the indigenous forces, found themselves trapped. Their resistance was futile. Forced capitulation followed immediately, and the proud conquistadors, heroes of the defense just yesterday, found themselves under arrest by their former comrade. While Cusco changed hands, the fate of another major Spanish settlement hung in the balance. While Almagro consolidated his power in Cusco, having arrested the Pizarro brothers and defeated the Incas, Francisco Pizarro himself found himself in a desperate situation. In Lima, his newly established capital, he was besieged by Manco Capac's forces, and his position grew increasingly precarious. Desperately in need of reinforcements, he appealed to his allies for aid. Alonso de Alvarado's contingent, dispatched from Trujillo for relief, rushed through the mountain passes, unaware that their fate had already been sealed. Diego de Almagro, with his characteristic tactical shrewdness, set an ambush at Abancay. This was not merely a battle, but a cold calculation. Alvarado was routed, and his soldiers, left with no choice, swelled Almagro's ranks. "Now we have enough men to finish what we started," his commanders might have said, seeing the Adelantado's forces double at the expense of yesterday's adversaries. Thus one enmity compounded another, creating an ominous symphony of doom, where one success meant another's ruin. Following the brilliant victory at Abancay, when Alonso de Alvarado's forces were not merely defeated, but joined his banners, Diego de Almagro found himself at the zenith of his power. His army, hardened by the Chilean hardships and invigorated by the recent triumph, numerically surpassed Francisco Pizarro's forces. It seemed as though destiny itself pointed the way to a definitive resolution of the conflict. Almagro's officers, especially the fierce Rodrigo de Ordóñez, insisted on an immediate and decisive thrust towards Lima. Their arguments were simple and pragmatic. Pizarro was weakened, his positions vulnerable, and only a swift strike could put an end to this furious feud once and for all. Taking Lima would mean not only eliminating the main rival, but also uniting all conquered lands under Almagro's rule. This was a moment when ambition and opportunity converged, offering a chance for absolute power in the New World. However, history, as is known, enjoys irony, and the most obvious steps do not always lead to a predictable outcome. Following the triumph at Abancay, when Alonso de Alvarado's forces defected to his side, Diego de Almagro reached the pinnacle of his power. His officers, particularly Rodrigo de Ordóñez, insisted on an immediate assault on Lima to definitively crush the weakened Francisco Pizarro. The strategic initiative lay entirely with the Adelantado. However, at this fateful moment, Almagro made what was arguably his fatal error. He refused a decisive march on the capital, preferring to remain in Cusco. What stopped this seasoned conquistador? Was it a flicker of conscience, an unwillingness to shed the blood of fellow countrymen in civil strife? Or perhaps fear of the crown's inevitable retribution for open defiance against the great Marquis? It is not unlikely that it was simply a fatal strategic miscalculation, an underestimation of the necessity to finish off his enemy. This indecision, this refusal to deliver the final blow, laid the groundwork for his future tragedy. Almagro seemed to freeze on the edge of an abyss. This pause did not bring him safety. It merely postponed the inevitable. The true cost of his hesitation concerned not only tactics, but also the higher interests of the Spanish crown. The Spanish crown, observing its overseas possessions from afar, viewed them not only as a source of gold, but also as a symbol of its own grandeur. Internecine warfare among the conquistadors, these nominal servants of the monarch, was not merely a disgrace. It was a crime against state interest, undermining the fragile stability of the conquered lands. In the eyes of the still unbroken Incas, such disputes appeared as a fatal weakness, calling into question the legitimacy of the Spanish presence. Diego de Almagro likely realized this paradox. Having reached the peak of his power, holding the keys to Cusco and the captive Pizarro brothers, he seemed to ponder for the first time the consequences of open, total conflict. He might have feared that an immediate strike on Lima, however justified it seemed to his officers, would forever brand him a rebel in the eyes of Charles V. This newfound caution, dictated by a desire to preserve his own standing and avoid ultimate disgrace, prompted him to an unexpected maneuver. Instead of a decisive offensive, he chose a waiting position, hoping that time would play into his hands, not his adversaries. Pizarro, besieged in Lima, found himself in an extremely vulnerable position. His forces were exhausted, reinforcements were absent, and his only hope lay in time and chance. This was the moment when Almagro, possessing undeniable numerical superiority and control over key territory, could have delivered the decisive blow. However, instead of a resolute offensive that could have ended the civil war, Diego de Almagro, to the surprise of many, opted for months-long negotiations. Perhaps he feared the crown's wrath for full-scale bloodshed, or perhaps he was overcome by a fatal indecisiveness. But these protracted diplomatic maneuvers, full of empty promises and mutual suspicions, only played into his opponent's hands, granting Pizarro invaluable respite. And while attention was fixed on the negotiation table, new moves were already being prepared in the shadows, capable of turning the tide. While Diego de Almagro hesitated, bogged down in feigned negotiations, Pizarro's camp was not idle. The walls of Cusco, seemingly secure in holding prisoners, proved not so impregnable in the face of gold and cunning. Gonzalo Pizarro and Alonso de Alvarado, once captured by Almagro, made a daring escape. Without waiting for the outcome of diplomatic maneuvers, they found a loophole in human weakness. The guards, bribed by promises of untold riches, or perhaps fearing swift retribution, allowed them to slip away into the night. This was not merely an act of freedom, but an ominous precursor. In a world where honor and word were worth less than a handful of gold dust, any agreement was merely a temporary reprieve, and trust a luxury the conquistadors could not afford. Each new deception drove the wedge deeper between the former comrades, preparing the ground for a new, even more brutal phase of confrontation. In this tense standoff, as strategic initiative slipped from Diego de Almagro's grasp, he paradoxically agreed to accept licentiate Gaspar de Espinosa for negotiations, a man, though respected, clearly loyal to Francisco Pizarro. Espinosa earnestly appealed to reason, urging Almagro about the ruinous nature of further internecine strife for all of Peru and the inevitable wrath of the crown, which would not tolerate such bloody self-governance. The argument seemed undeniable, and any pragmatist would have conceded. However, Almagro, worn down by decades of Pizarro's deceptions and perfidy, could not simply abandon his claims. His will, hardened by Chilean hardships and recent victories, demanded not merely peace, but a fair, as he saw it, division of power and territories, primarily Cusco. He did not fully succumb to persuasion, insisting on his share, which determined the subsequent, even more tragic phase of their relationship. In an attempt to avoid further bloodshed, which was depleting the conquistadors' strength and undermining the crown's authority, Diego de Almagro and Francisco Pizarro finally agreed to arbitration. Friar Francisco de Bobadilla served as mediator, called by his holy office to bring peace to this fractured world. His terms seemed reasonable, yet in essence they were naive, given the nature of the rivals. Hernando Pizarro was to be immediately released from captivity. Cusco, the apple of discord, was temporarily handed over to Marquess Francisco Pizarro, and officers from both sides were to be sent to Spain for King Charles V to render a final decision. This was a fragile compromise, built on the shifting sands of mutual distrust, where each participant, it seemed, saw only a temporary respite, not a true resolution of the conflict. The idea that a paper decree or a priest's word could tame the insatiable greed and ambition of the conquistadors was, perhaps, the greatest illusion in this bloody drama. No sooner had the chains fallen from Hernando Pizarro, meticulously negotiated by Almagro, during those false talks, than any illusion of peace was mercilessly cast aside. This act of goodwill, on the part of the old adelantado, proved to be nothing more than a tactical concession, paving the way for the complete collapse of the fragile truce. Marquess Francisco Pizarro, freed from the burden of diplomacy, and perhaps from the remnants of his conscience, proclaimed what had likely always been his true conviction: only arms will decide who will be master of Peru. These words were not just a threat, but a declaration of war. Within days, a feverish mobilization of forces began under his command. Veterans and new adventurers, eager for their share in the division of the Inca Empire, flocked to Pizarro's banners. Foreshadowing the final, bloody battle. The path to Cusco, to the heart of this deadly confrontation, was already set, and each step brought the conquistadors closer to the point of no return. Immediately after the treacherous breach of the truce, when the last chance for peace was irrevocably lost, Francisco Pizarro embarked on a decisive mobilization. He gathered around 700 men under his banners, experienced veterans and fresh recruits, placing his brothers, Gonzalo and Hernando, freshly released from captivity, at the head of this force. Their path to Cusco was meticulously planned. Instead of a direct but dangerous march through the impassable mountain passes that Almagro seemingly should have held, Pizarro chose a longer but safer route along the coast. This decision reflected his pragmatism and unwillingness to take risks when time was on his side. Diego de Almagro, with his tactical acumen, could have anticipated this maneuver and occupied the key passes, but Pio. Instead, he made a fatal error. Confident in his numerical superiority, or perhaps paralyzed by indecision, he remained in the valley, awaiting his opponent where he had no intention of appearing. This inaction, this waiting approach, cost him the initiative and strategic advantage. The fate of Peru seemed already sealed by this silent march. At dawn on April 26, 1538, on the salt flats of Las Salinas, near Cusco, the hour of reckoning arrived. Two armies, once united in their conquests, clashed in a deadly struggle, driven not only by ambition, but by deep personal hatred accumulated over years of rivalry. This was not merely a battle for land or gold, but the culmination of a bloody drama where yesterday's comrades became irreconcilable enemies. The ferocity with which both sides fought was striking. Every sword stroke, every shot was steeped in the bitterness of betrayal. However, the decisive factor that tipped the scales in Pizarro's favor was not only numerical superiority, but also superior firepower. Experienced musketeers sent by the Spanish king, whose discipline and accuracy were unparalleled, unleashed a hail of lead upon Almagro's forces, thinning their ranks and sowing panic. Their volleys, methodical and deadly, became the embodiment of new military technology, ruthlessly suppressing outdated tactics. Pizarro's victory was absolute, but its price was horrifying. And that price would soon become evident. The dust raised by the furious melee at Las Salinas settled, revealing the grim harvest of a fratricidal war. The battlefield was strewn with bodies. Approximately 140 Spaniards perished in this clash, a staggering number for a conflict between countrymen once united by a common goal. But the ruthlessness of the victors was not confined to the battlefield. Rodrigo de Ordóñez, Almagro's loyal and brave lieutenant, was captured and executed without delay, as were many other high-ranking officers and devoted supporters of the defeated Adelantado. This was not a war for honor or glory, but a merciless struggle for absolute power, where prisoners were granted no quarter, only swift retribution. Immediately after the bloody carnage at Las Salinas, the victorious forces of the Pizarro brothers, without losing a moment, rushed to Cusco. The city, having already endured sieges and plunder, once again fell under the sway of the conquistadors. Exhausted, elderly, and ill, Diego de Almagro, who had not yet recovered from the defeat, was captured in his quarters. His fall was as swift as his recent ascent. The irony of fate was that even the unimaginable treasures of the Inca capital, once again subjected to ruthless plundering, could not quench the insatiable greed of the conquerors. Gold and silver, ripped from temples and palaces, only stoked new appetites, demanding ever larger shares and new horizons for their satisfaction. In this endless thirst lay the true essence of their campaign. The field of Las Salinas, drenched in blood, became merely another stage in this ceaseless race for wealth. Hernando Pizarro, the victor on the battlefield, wasted no time. He proceeded to divide the spoils, generously distributing captured treasures and lands among his soldiers. Notably, many of Almagro's former soldiers, whose loyalty had now shifted to the victors, were also included in this process. This pragmatic act was not a display of mercy, but rather a strategic move aimed at consolidating forces and ensuring further expansion. For the conquest of Peru, as it turned out, was merely a prologue to new conquests. The insatiable thirst for gold and power that drove the conquistadors across oceans and mountains knew no bounds, and while some set off in search of new Eldorados, the fate of the defeated Diego de Almagro hung in the balance, awaiting its formal resolution. Francisco Pizarro's triumph at Las Salinas left no room for doubt about his absolute authority. With the fall of Cusco and the capture of Diego de Almagro, the Marquis faced not so much a dilemma as the inexorable necessity to eliminate a former comrade who had become an irreconcilable enemy. In the world of conquistadors, where ambitions were boundless and loyalty ephemeral, the fate of the defeated was often predetermined. Thus began the trial of Almagro, a sheer farce, intended only to lend legitimacy to a merciless sentence. The accusations, brought forth by Hernando Pizarro and others loyal to the Marquis, were boilerplate: treason against the crown, rebellion, seizure of Cusco. This was not justice, but a display of power, where the judges were merely executors of the victor's will. In this cruel theater of power, where every step was dictated by a thirst for absolute control, Almagro was about to hear his verdict, which already hung in the air, leaving no hope for mercy. The verdict handed down to Diego de Almagro was predictable, yet no less brutal. Upon hearing the death sentence, the old adelantado, whose body was worn down by years of campaigns and a recent battle, initially pleaded for mercy. He invoked his advanced age, his loyalty to the crown, and the injustice of the charges, as if trying to awaken some remnant of humanity in his executioners. But Francisco Pizarro remained unyielding. Soon, realizing the futility of his pleas, Almagro regained his characteristic courage. His voice became firm, his gaze calm. He accepted his fate like a warrior ready for his last stand, even if it was unequal and unarmed. This was the final display of his indomitable spirit in the face of an inevitable end. His last battle was no longer for Cusco, nor for gold, but for dignity. The sentence against Diego de Almagro was carried out with ostentatious, almost ritualistic cruelty. The once proud adelantado, companion and rival, was garroted in his prison cell, deprived even of the final dignity of a public death on the scaffold. But even after his death, his ordeal was not over. As a warning to all who might dare to defy, Almagro's decapitated corpse was displayed for public view in Cusco's main square. This monstrous act was not merely an execution. It became a public humiliation, a stark lesson intended to assert Francisco Pizarro's absolute and undeniable power over the conquered lands and souls. It was an unambiguous, bloody signal. Any challenge to his dominion would be punished most ruthlessly. It seemed this extreme measure was intended to extinguish the sparks of resistance forever. Yet history often teaches lessons about the futility of such displays. For all cruelty has its price, and every drop of blood spilled inevitably leads to a thirst for retribution. Diego de Almagro's death did not bring the longed-for peace to rebellious Peru. On the contrary, it only fueled the flames of hatred that had seemingly subsided after the Battle of Las Salinas. The execution of the old adelantado, carried out so publicly and cruelly, became not an end, but a trigger for a new cycle of bloodshed, initiated by the victor's own hand. Those loyal to Almagro, who had shared with him the hardships of the Chilean desert and the bitterness of defeat, could not forgive Pizarro for this display of absolute power. Their rage, mixed with despair and a deep sense of injustice, found a new, unexpected focal point. Young Diego de Almagro, son of the executed man, known as El Mozo. Around him rallied all the wronged, all the dispossessed, all those yearning for retribution. In their hearts burned not just resentment, but a burning, insatiable thirst for revenge. The decision was unanimous and irreversible. Francisco Pizarro, the triumphant victor and executioner, would have to pay for Almagro's spilled blood. This verdict, whispered in dark corners, was not merely an act of vengeance. It marked the inevitable continuation of a vicious cycle of violence, where every seeming victory only postponed a new, even bloodier reckoning. Reveling in his triumph over Almagro, and establishing himself as the undisputed ruler of Peru, Francisco Pizarro seemed to have reached the apex of his power. His arrogance grew proportionally with his conquests. He was deaf to the whispers of impending doom, to warnings of a conspiracy brewing among the numerous supporters of the executed Almagro, who had rallied around his young son, Diego el Mozo. Pizarro, convinced of his invulnerability and infallibility, fatally underestimated the depth of hatred he had sown. For pride comes before a fall, as the old wisdom states, and this principle manifested mercilessly in the Marquis's fate. He failed to understand that the cruelty that had forged his power was now undermining its foundations, paving the way for inevitable retribution. The seeds of revenge he had sown yielded an abundant harvest. Lima seemed to be Francisco Pizarro's stronghold of power, where the Marquis enjoyed the fruits of bloody victories. But the shadows of the past, cast by Diego de Almagro's execution, gathered. The thirst for vengeance, fueled by humiliation, did not wane in the hearts of the men of Chile. The late Adelantado's supporters, who had rallied around his young son, Diego el Mozo. On June 26, 1541, as Lima sank into its afternoon slumber, a group of conspirators stormed the Marquis's palace. Cries of, "Long live the king! Death to the tyrant!" shattered the silence. Pizarro, elderly but still warlike, seized his sword and shield. The superior forces of the Almagristas, led by Juan de Herrada, were relentless. A wounded Pizarro fell. His last moments, an attempt to draw a cross with his own blood, preceded the fatal blow. Thus ended Francisco Pizarro's life path, not on the battlefield with the Incas, but at the hands of his countrymen, in the very heart of his empire. This was not merely an act of retribution, but an inevitable echo of the cruelty and lawlessness he himself had sown. With the Marquis's death, the bloody cycle of violence closed, only to give rise to new spirals. A bitter irony of fate, like an ominous echo of their own actions, befell both conquistadors. Francisco Pizarro, killed in his palace, and Diego de Almagro, executed by his rival's verdict, fell not by the hands of the Incas, but by the blades and intrigues of their own countrymen. This was not just the personal end of two ambitious lives consumed by an insatiable thirst for power and gold, but a vivid testament to the chaos and lawlessness that reigned in the newly acquired lands. In Peru, where a great empire had crumbled just yesterday, rule was now dictated not by the Spanish crown, but by brute force, personal vengeance, and boundless greed, born of untold riches. The conquerors, who had brought so much destruction and suffering to the local population, themselves, became victims of the uncontrollable system they had created. Their demise, so similar in its tragic essence, symbolized the decay of moral foundations and foreshadowed further upheavals, marking a somber prologue to a long and bloody struggle for power and resources in the newly established viceroyalty, where personal ambitions continued to dominate over any semblance of order. Thus concluded the bloody epic of two partners whose names became synonymous with the conquest of Peru. Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro, both fallen at the hands of their countrymen, became victims of the insatiable thirst for power and gold that they themselves had sown. Their personal enmity, rooted in the ambiguity of royal decrees and boundless ambition, undermined the stability of the newly formed viceroyalty. The price of this struggle was measured not only in the lives of the conquistadors, but also in the further chaos that engulfed the already devastated Inca civilization. Their fates serve as a grim reminder that conquest, however glorious it may seem, often devours its creators, leaving behind only a trail of violence and unending strife. And this was just one of the first acts of the drama unfolding in the new land.